just share my screen here. Okay, so I put this question up here because it has composition of functions, but they're presented in a little bit different ways. Two of the functions are equations and one is the graph. So remember I said you might get a combination of presentation of the data. You perhaps might get some ordered pairs. You might get a graph or you might get an equation. So K is all three functions composed. So starting with G and then F and then H of X. So let's say, for example, it asks you to find K of 5. So we're going to start with the inside function, which is H of X. So the first thing we want to do is H of 5. H is an equation, and it is negative x plus 3. So we're going to sub in 5 into there and get our output value of negative 2. So then that output value becomes the input for the next function, which is f. So now we want to do f of negative 2. F is given as the graph. So we're going to go over to the graph. We don't need to know the equation of the graph. We just need to look and find the value at negative 2 along the x-axis and see what the y value is, which is 0. So we just read it off the graph. And then finally, we're going to take that output and put it into the next function, which is g. So we want to do g of 0. And g is 2x plus 1. So we'll sub that in. And we get a final answer of 1. So that means k of 5, after we did all those compositions, equals 1, right? Final output. So that is a good example of where they're just giving you a variety of functions presented in different ways. Okay. The second one, I just pulled out a word problem. So this is an application of combining functions. So we are given some information about a product. It says that the company sells the product for $15.80 per unit. And the cost to make the product is $9.45 per unit plus a fixed operating cost. So usually a fixed cost is purchase of equipment, rent of the building, anything that only is paid once, right? It's a fixed value. And then the $9.45 is a variable cost because it changes depending on how many units you produce. So A asks for a cost function. So we want cost in terms of x. Well, the cost will depend on two things. The variable part, so $9.45 for each unit, and then the fixed part, which is $52,000. B asks for sales. So we want the sales in terms of x. Well, I know I sell the product for $15.80 per unit. So that's how I make money. And then C asks for a function that represents profit. Well, profit, I make profit by selling my product, but then I have to subtract the cost it takes me to make the profit, or to make the product. So I'm going to take my sales and subtract my cost. So my profit would be the sales function minus the cost function. So we're combining these two functions. So it would be 1580x and then subtract the cost. So make sure you put it in brackets because you are subtracting. So we want to make sure that the signs are correct. And then I just have to subtract the values for x. So we just have to subtract 1580 minus 945. Is 635x and then minus 52,000. So that would be my profit equation. Okay, and then once I had that, they might ask me a certain number of units. Okay, so that's a typical combining function where you have two functions that you either want to add together or subtract or maybe even multiply. This one is similar to one we did the other day in the lesson. So it has given us we have a circle with radius r. So first it wants us to write a function of the circle's area in terms of r, the radius. So we know the formula for area is pi r squared. Right, so I am writing area as a function of radius, so a of r is pi r squared. Then it wants us to write a function for the radius in terms of the circumference. Okay, well I know that circumference is 2 pi r, but it wants us to write a function for the radius in terms of the circumference. That means it wants us to isolate for r because it wants it in terms of r, right, in terms of the radius. So c over 2 pi is the radius in terms of circumference. Okay, so I have to isolate that formula for r. And then it wants me to do composition with a of r of c. So a of r of c means put this formula here into the area for the r. So a of r of c would equal pi. Instead of radius, we're going to put r of c. So c over 2 pi, and then square it. So that's similar to the question we did earlier, except we had to isolate this time for r because it was given the circumference, and we just had to isolate for r. Okay, so those are just some typical questions on composition or combining. Now let's just have a look at the review. So I'm assuming everybody can see that question.